This is the first of 6 sessions on the first letter to the Thessalonians, the early Paul. Today we will not talk about 1 Thessalonians as much as we will talk about kind of a favorite topic of mine, how not to read the letters of Paul. And we will get to that. First of all, I'll give you some of the information that I think you would want to know. In order to read Paul in a reasonable and good way, let me take this off. I think we're all right with that. So I'm going to give you at first the material that gives you the presuppositions of what Pauline scholars, mainstream Pauline scholars believe about the interpretation of Paul. And at the very end, I will give you 8 or 9 interpretations of Paul that I think are quite wrong, and I'll tell you about some of them, about why I think they are wrong. So, in any event, we'll see. I'm trying to find my handkerchief. When you do this, you have to kind of figure out where your pockets are. It's very complicated. Okay, there we are. Okay. We will run for 6 weeks. Next week we will begin on 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. Today being how not to read Paul's letters. Okay. First of all, let's start with the New Testament. The New Testament is a collection of collections of early Christian writings. In fact, it may be a collection of collections of early Christian writings. And by that I mean writings produced by followers of Jesus. They may not have used the word Christian of themselves. They probably would have used the word Jesus believers, or believers in the way, or followers of, they were Jews normally. And they did not think of themselves at first as part of a religion different than the religion that we know as Judaism. The New Testament is a collection of collections of writings by Jesus believers, and most of it is written during the 1st century CE. We use the term CE, Common Era, and that's the same era as AD. But there are people that study the Bible along with us who are not Christians, and so to say AD means the year of the Lord. And if you don't consider Jesus the Lord, then it doesn't make sense to use the term AD. And so biblical scholars since the 70s have had a kind of a neutral term to indicate the era that we are in now as CE, and then BCE is before the Common Era. But it's the same years that are meant by Anno Domini and before Christ. The earliest collection of writings of the New Testament is the group of 14 letters known as the Pauline corpus. It contains letters written by Paul himself. It also contains letters written by other people in Paul's name after his death. We'll talk a little more about that next week. It also, at the very end of the letter, at the end of the Pauline corpus, or the Corpus Paulinum, as some of my European colleagues call it, it contains the letter to the Hebrews, which is actually not, in terms of its genre, is not actually a letter. It is anonymous, and it also has nothing to do with Paul. Now, the second earliest collection of writings in the New Testament is the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But they were not around when Paul was writing his letters, as far as we have evidence, okay? Many positive things have been said about Paul and his importance in the early church. The most important, I think, is that Paul was the earliest Christian writer. And he is also considered the greatest missionary of all time. By missionary, I mean a church planter. That's, by the way, what an apostolos was in the 1st century. An apostolos was a traveling church planter. And then by the time, after Paul died, then the apostles died, they were replaced by the bishops. And the bishops have jurisdiction in a particular church or a particular city. They were not traveling church planters, but that's what the apostles were. and St. Paul was the greatest. James D.G. Dunn, who was the Lightfoot Professor of Divinity at the University of Durham and who died recently, said that Paul has been called the first and greatest Christian theologian. And most biblical scholars would agree with that, almost all. And then in the famous Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, edited by Frank Leslie Cross at Oxford, he, by the way, was the organizer of the quadrennial conference of people who study early Christian literature after the New Testament. It's the patristic conference. And F.L. Cross organized that for years. And he edited the Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, which is, when you go to an Episcopal seminary, you will buy that on the first or second day of seminary, okay? Otherwise, you won't know what people are talking about. But Paul, in the ODCC, is referred to by Cross as the most powerful human personality in the history of the church. I cannot disagree with that. My teacher wrote an article in the Encyclopedia of Religion, and he said something to the effect that Paul was behind most of the major controversies, and I agree with that too. Now, when we're talking about anything that was written in the 1st century CE, we're talking about antiquity, right? The ancient world. The ancient world did things differently than the world that we live in now. And so in order to know anything about the ancient world, you have to know the nature of your sources. If you don't have any sources, then you don't know anything about the ancient world, right? Now, we distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources. The primary source is a source is written directly by somebody who had something to do with the event being studied, like an eyewitness or the person who actually did the thing that we're talking about. That is a primary source. A secondary source is what somebody else says about it, okay? A secondary source is written by someone other than the person that we are studying, or someone other than an eyewitness. And so we distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources. You could argue that some sources are actually tertiary, and that is a possibility. But in using historical criticism, namely looking at the Bible historically, as I do, and without apology, we must distinguish between primary sources and secondary sources. So that brings us to the first major problem. How exactly do you know anything about Paul? Well, see the big circle there? There's a lot that we learn about Paul from Paul's letters. And then there is some that we learn about Paul from the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. Do you see that in this diagram there is some overlap between what we learn about Paul from Paul's own letters, i.e. primary source, and what we learn about Paul from Acts, i.e. the secondary source? Now, and so that tells you a lot, and therein lies much of the problem and much of the controversies, or as my British friends say, controversies, over the interpretation of Paul. The problem with Paul is not, the problem that, like certain prophets of the Old Testament or certain kings, or, when was creation, the problem with Paul is not that we don't have enough information. The problem with Paul is we have so much information between Paul's letters and Acts, as well as other information elsewhere. The problem is in sorting out the information and in where there is some problems. In other words, where our sources do not agree with each other. I mean, if the sources always agree, there's no problem. It doesn't matter if they're primary or secondary. If the sources all agree, everything's hunky-dory. When the sources do not agree, then you have to rank your sources. And here is where people like me part company with certain other people in the Christian world. And so when you look at the authentic letters of Paul, we are looking at primary sources, unquestionably. When we look at the book of the Acts of the Apostles, in my view and in the view of most Paul scholars, we're looking at a secondary source. And when you look at the letters in the New Testament that are attributed to Paul, but not really by Paul, such as the 3 Deutero-Pauline letters, Colossians, Ephesians, and 2 Thessalonians, not really by Paul, most likely, and the 3 pastoral letters, clearly not by Paul, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, these cannot be considered primary sources. If you think Paul wrote them, they would be primary sources. But since most of us don't think Paul wrote them, then you cannot consider them as a primary source. Also, there's other information about Hellenistic and Roman culture. We'll learn a little bit about that today, about rhetoric. And there's also information about Judaism adds to our knowledge as well. Part of the problem with using parallels from rabbinic Judaism is that the writings that we have from the rabbis are 200 or 300 years later than the New Testament. And so the value and meaning of the sources from Judaism, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and especially the rabbis, these are intensely debated by my colleagues, okay? By the way, we know a lot about Paul because he was from Tarsus. In Acts, the letter in the Acts of the Apostles, there are 3 chapters where Paul speaks about himself. Acts 9, the so-called conversion of Paul, Acts 11, and Acts 21. In Acts 21, Paul says, I am a man, a Jew from Tarsus of Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, as the King James Version said. And now I think we're saying a citizen of no insignificant city. Tarsus was a very well-known city. Strabo, the geographer, tells us a great deal about it in his geography. And here's what he said. He talks about all of these philosophers who lived and taught philosophy in Tarsus. And he lists them. Among the Stoics, Antipater and Archidamus and Nestor, also the 2 Athenodorus. Nestor of my time was an academician. Other philosophers from Tarsus are Plutiades and Diogenes. But it is Rome that is best able to tell us the number of learned men from this city. For Rome is full of Tarsians and Alexandrians. Which is to say that, I mean, the modern university even the medieval university didn't exist. But nonetheless, there were a bunch of philosophers, 7 Stoic philosophers who made their home in Tarsus. And so it would be very reasonable for Paul to have learned philosophy from them. And it would be reasonable because the pop philosophy in that time was Stoicism. Tarsus was well known for its philosophers. It should not be a surprise that Paul makes use of Stoic technical terms and ideas as he does in chapter 1 of Romans. If you were to read Romans 1:18, Paul makes an argument for the existence of God based on the order of creation. You see an order in creation. That order in creation should tell you, if you are not crazy, that should tell you, if you have the use of reason, that there has to be a reason for the order in creation, namely a creator of the creation. And so that's a classic Stoic argument. And so the argument is from the order in creation pointing to the creator. Very Stoic indeed. And then in 2 Corinthians 4, Paul talks there about passions and sufferings. Pathemata, we translate that as sufferings. Apathos is suffering, and pathos becomes passio in Latin, or passion. Paul gives a twist on the Stoic idea. The Stoic idea is sufferings are bad, and what you try to do in life is you try to get rid of the sufferings. And if you get rid of the sufferings, you'll have a happy life. And so Paul talks about the sufferings of Christ overflow onto us. But nonetheless, eventually there will be thanksgiving and joy. If you were to read in Romans 8, Paul says, the sufferings of the present time are not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to be revealed. So Paul uses some Stoic terminology and Stoic ideas, but he is certainly not afraid of putting a twist on it. Paul loves to put twists on things, let me tell you. By the way, what Paul's education was as he grew up, because he was the first really educated writer of the New Testament. I mean, he was the first writer and the earliest writer and the most educated. His education has been the subject of intense debate by my colleagues. The book of Acts tells us that Paul studied with Gamaliel, the famous liberal rabbi in Jerusalem. That's very interesting because Paul's mother tongue was Greek. Paul's mother tongue was not Hebrew. We have no evidence that Paul knew Hebrew. Paul in his letters says nothing about studying with the famous liberal rabbi Gamaliel. In Galatians, the letter of the Galatians, he says that he was not known by sight to the leaders of the Jerusalem church. And that would be very strange if he had studied in Jerusalem with Gamaliel. See? He actually says in his narration of Galatians, by the way, I was not known by sight to any of, Peter, James, and John, or any of the leaders of the church. And if he had studied with the most famous liberal rabbi of the day, he probably would have been known in Jerusalem, you see. Then as we go on, Paul's use of Stoic words and ideas in Romans and in the Corinthian letters strongly suggests that he had studied philosophy with some Stoic, maybe more than one. And Tarsus would have been the natural place for Paul to have studied Stoic philosophy. And it would not have been impossible for him to have studied philosophy in Jerusalem as well. The problem is when you try to set the Greco-Roman Paul over against the Jewish Paul, as many writers try to do, is that ignores the fact that Judaism in Paul's time had already been Hellenized for more than 150 years before Paul was born. In other words, there were already Greek-speaking synagogues. That's the places where Paul goes in the book of Acts. He goes to Greek-speaking synagogues, right? And his mother tongue was not Aramaic, and nobody's mother tongue was Hebrew, but his mother tongue was Hellenistic Greek. Greek was the common language in the early empire, including the capital of Cilicia, namely Tarsus. Paul, therefore, seems to have been uniquely qualified to bring the gospel to Gentiles. Greek was his mother tongue, and it was the language in which he knew the Bible, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament. He was fully at home in the Mediterranean region. He knew where he was going. He was a citizen of the Roman Empire. That was the reason that he was not crucified like Peter, but he was beheaded. He was at home in Greek-speaking synagogues, right? He probably grew up in one. He was a very effective preacher to Gentiles, and he was the most prolific planter of churches, okay? So Paul is a unique fellow. The typical sequence of education in Paul's time, and in the time of Cicero, and in the time of Quintilian in the 1st century CE, about 5 to 10% of people could read and write. In smaller towns and villages, it would be closer to 5 or less. But let's say 5% of people could read and write. And if you could read and write, that means that you've gone to school. Okay? Now, where did you go to school? The first place to go to school would be an educated slave in your household, and you would learn grammar. Everybody that went to school did that. And then many students learned rhetoric, okay? By the way, in Homer, what is the education of the young Achilles supposed to consist of? According to Homer, the young Achilles was to be taught to speak words and to do deeds. So you see, the training in rhetoric, how to speak persuasive words, goes back way far, way beyond Aristotle. And then for a few students, there would be people who learned philosophy. And Paul could very well have been one of those that learned philosophy. And Tarsus was the perfect place to do it. And then the question that I have answered many times in writing, in my publications, is did Paul know or use rhetoric? And many of us trained in the 80s believe that Paul was trained in rhetoric. Now, it's also possible that he picked up rhetoric without formal training. But how do you know? Well, we don't have a videotape of Paul learning rhetoric, Paul in a rhetorical school, but we have his letters. So the logical place would be to read the letters and see if you can find rhetorical features in the letters, and then compare that with rhetorical features in handbooks and speeches and letters. St. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, who was the greatest theologian of the Western Church, who had been very well trained in rhetoric in Rome, and he actually had a municipal job teaching rhetoric to boys. And St. Augustine wrote a book called De Doctrina Christiana, on how to teach Christianity. And book 4 of De Doctrina Christiana, on the teaching of Christianity, Paul said twice that Paul's letters flowed with both eloquence, which is a technical rhetorical term, and sapientia, wisdom. And we know from elsewhere in literature that if your writings had both eloquentia and sapientia, both eloquence and wisdom, that was a traditional phrase that was used to denote an ideal rhetoric. You had eloquence, and eloquence means it flowed beautifully and was kind of persuasive. And then if it has sapientia or wisdom, it was actually telling the truth. So it's told well and it happens to be the truth. That's an ideal rhetoric. And so Paul also considered himself to be an apostle, and he actually lists in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following all these resurrection appearances that he's heard about. And he's heard about a bunch of them. And then in 15:8 he says, lastly, as to an abortion, as to somebody ripped out of the womb at the wrong time, an ektroma, he appeared also to me. And of course, that is the appearance of Christ that is his commissioning as an apostle. He also says in Galatians 1:16, his next to first letter, his second letter, he says that the point of the revelation of God to me was so that, quote, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles. He actually gives his mission statement. The appearance of Christ to me, the calling of me as an apostle was, quote, so that I might proclaim him among the Gentiles, okay? So that means that Paul is the earliest writer in the New Testament, and Paul considers himself the head honcho of the church, that part of the church that is preaching and trying to convert Gentiles. By the way, the Pauline corpus is not arranged in order of chronology, or in order of time. It's arranged in order of length, believe it or not. And so first it has letters by Paul to churches, either real or alleged, in order of length. Letters by Paul to individuals in order of length. And at the very end of the Pauline corpus, as if no one knows what to do with it perhaps, is the letter to the Hebrews. And so the order of the Pauline corpus, this is the Pauline corpus in order, starting with Romans, and then Corinthians and Galatians. Those are the 4 letters that have almost never had their authorship doubted by anybody, except by the Dutch radicals in the early 19th century. But other than that, no one has ever doubted the authenticity of Romans, Corinthians, and Galatians. And we still call those 4 letters the Hauptbriefe, the main letters, the head letters. After Galatians, going in order, in declining order of length, there's Ephesians, which has 6 chapters. There's Philippians that has 4 chapters. There's Colossians that has 4 chapters. 1 Thessalonians has 5 chapters, but they're not long. And 2 Thessalonians has 3 chapters. And then you go to other letters that are written, and in terms of their titles, they're written to other people rather than churches. 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy and Titus, those 3 are called the pastoral epistles, because those are about how do you run the church, okay? And then the final letter by Paul to anybody is a short letter, in fact only 25 verses, one single chapter but only 25 verses, the letter to Philemon. And the issue is the return of a runaway slave that Paul has been harboring. And then at the end of the Pauline corpus is the anonymous work, Hebrews, which doesn't claim to be by Paul, and except for chapter 13, does not look form critically. It does not look like a letter. Okay? Now, we'd like to know which one was first. And you can only establish which one was first. Hey, we're doing really good on time. You can only establish which one was first if you know where Paul was. And if you don't know where Paul was, then you've got no way of knowing which one was first and which one was second and which one was last. So in order to figure out the order of the writing of the letters, you've got to figure out the geography and chronology of Paul. And basically you have to decide what you can figure out from Paul's letters, and then you also have to decide about how much of the book of Acts you believe in terms of its history and in terms of the chronology of Paul. And so most scholars today, except for conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists, many scholars believe that Acts has to be used very, very carefully and only with reference to what can be confirmed in Paul's own letters. In other words, if you go back to that graphic like this, go back to this graphic, what we learn about Paul from Acts and is not actually confirmed by what we learn about Paul from Paul's letters, then you have a problem. In other words, the question is, if it's in Paul's letters, we don't doubt it. If it's in Paul's letters and Acts, we really don't doubt it. If it's in Acts alone, that's where there is, that's where doubt creeps in, and there's good reason for that doubt. Okay, where are we? My teacher, Robert Jewett, wrote a big dissertation which ended up being 2 books. And the first part was published second. It was published by Fortress in '79, and it was called A Chronology of Paul's Life, and it was co-published by SCM in London, and it's called Dating Paul's Life, and it's still available. But in Bob Jewett's chronology, he actually developed a chronology primarily, maybe not totally, but primarily from the letters, and not totally from the letters. Now, Gerd Ludemann, that I studied with in Göttingen during my Fulbright year, he said that he did it. He said that he was writing a chronology strictly from Paul's letters, and you have to decide whether that is really true. But anyway, he wrote a book. It's about this thick, and he calculated the dates. Jesus was crucified and risen either in 30 or 33. The more likely date is 33 CE. And then his death was calculated by Jewett to the year 62. Tradition has it that Paul was put to death while Nero was emperor. There is another tradition that Paul actually went to Spain, but that is dependent on Paul in Romans 15 saying, gee, I'd like to go to Spain. And so that is not very believable. It is not believable. So, in order to figure out the date of a Pauline letter, here's what you have to do. You have to figure out when Paul was there in that particular city to found the church. In other words, he preached in the synagogue on 3 Sabbaths, according to Acts 17 in Thessaloniki. You have to basically get Paul there preaching and gathering a group of people who become Jesus believers. Then Paul has to leave that city and go somewhere else. And then he hears about some problem, or there is some particular reason that he writes, that he actually writes a letter to Church A. See? So you got to get Paul to city A, have him go somewhere else to city B, or C, or D, or E. And then hearing about a problem in city A, he then writes letter to city, Church A. See? And it's kind of like plates spinning on the top of poles, right? So you have to figure out Paul's travels. And if you cannot figure out Paul's travels, then you do not have any way of dating Paul's letters. Okay, there's no other way. And that gives us a little problem here, because the book of Acts tells us that Paul was in Jerusalem 5 times. My God. And this, by the way, with Paul going to Jerusalem 5 times, this is how you come out with these quote-unquote 4 missionary journeys of Paul that you've seen in Bible atlases and in the backs of Bibles. You see Paul's 3 missionary journeys and the journey to Rome. That's based on Paul being in Jerusalem 5 times. Okay, fine. However, Galatians has Paul in Rome, in Jerusalem only twice. And then there's a planned visit that he mentions in 1 Corinthians 16. It has to do with the offering that he's raising for the relief of the Jerusalem church. And so the problem is in Galatians 1:18 and in Galatians 2, Paul says that he had not been in Jerusalem any time other than that. He says specifically he had not been in Jerusalem after he was called by Jesus as an apostle, and he did not go to Jerusalem again. I did not confer with flesh and blood. And that directly contradicts Acts. If you identify the Jerusalem conference that Paul describes in Galatians 2:1-10, if you identify that with Acts 15, where the Jerusalem conference is described, they have a conference, and it's decided that the Gentiles do not have to be circumcised, and they don't have to keep any of the other parts of the Jewish law, except they should stay away from blood and porneia, immorality. So you've got Paul saying there are 3 times I was in Jerusalem, or at least 2 plus, 2 or 3, and Acts confidently saying that Paul was in Jerusalem 5 times. And therein lies the problem of dating Paul's letters and doing chronology, is you have to decide whether you trust Acts or whether you trust Paul. Remember what we said about primary sources versus secondary sources. Paul's letters being the primary source and Acts being the secondary source. Keep that in mind. Let me show you 6 different ways in which Acts and Paul are not in agreement. The first was Paul was in Jerusalem 5 times in Acts and 3 times in Paul's letters. According to Acts, Paul circumcised Timothy, and he supported financially those taking a Nazirite vow. But in Galatians, Paul wrote that if you get your justification from keeping the law, including the command to circumcise males, you give up your justification in Christ. You can't get your justification by keeping Torah and also getting it in Christ. Okay? And also, Paul defended in Galatians the idea that Titus was present at the Jerusalem conference, but that he was not compelled to be circumcised, even though he was a Gentile. Then, the writer of Acts, if the writer of Acts was a companion of Paul, which is the tradition, this companion of Paul has got some serious gaps in his knowledge of Paul. The writer of Acts doesn't seem to know that Paul wrote letters, or that Paul wrote these letters to troubled congregations that he founded. The writer of Acts thinks that they had this meeting in Jerusalem in Acts 15, and then there were no more internal troubles in the church, right? Everything's hunky-dory, we've solved it all. Peter, James, and John agreed that the Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised or keep the Torah, and there are no more internal struggles in the church. Now, if you read the letters of Paul, you know that can't possibly be true, right? So the writer of Acts knows nothing about, or chooses to say nothing about, unorganized opposition to Paul. The writer of Acts also doesn't know or say anything about Paul's martyrdom in Rome. Acts ends with Paul in Rome under lighthouse arrest for 2 years. And he doesn't seem to know that, by the way, Paul was put to death by the Roman government. I want to say that. Pretty amazing for a companion of Paul, don't you think? Then, Acts implies that the Jerusalem conference happened relatively early in Paul's ministry, in Acts 15. And that Acts 15 is still very early in Paul's ministry. Paul has not been going around founding churches. They've just been in Antioch, where the disciples were first called Christians. They were in Syria. Why were they called Christians? Because they were Gentiles. They were not Jews. And so, in Galatians, however, Paul says that he was an apostle for 14 years. He was commissioned by Christ 14 years before he went to the regions of Syria and Cilicia. And then 3 years later, he went to Jerusalem. So if you believe the full 14 plus 3 years being 17, arithmetic's a good thing, isn't it? If you believe that Paul was an apostle for 17 years before the Jerusalem conference, which I think Paul says that quite directly in Galatians, then that gives you a little problem if you look at Acts suggesting, it doesn't say it, but it suggests that the Jerusalem conference was early in Paul's ministry. Okay? And also, Acts certainly suggests, more than suggests, that Paul and Barnabas' apostleship is secondary to the Jerusalem apostles. They did not see Jesus during his earthly life. They only saw the risen Christ. And so Paul says, I yielded submission to them not even for an hour. In Galatians he says that. And that when he got his commission from Jesus, he did not confer with flesh and blood. And he also opens Galatians by saying, Paul, an apostle, not from man or through man, but through a revelation of Jesus Christ. So Paul says he got his apostleship directly from Jesus. And that ain't exactly what Acts suggests. In fact, Acts suggests, basically in the first chapter of Acts, they need a new 12th apostle because of Judas. Well, they say, we need somebody who has been in and out with us and with the Lord Jesus and can be a witness to his resurrection. So they give a definition of apostleship that suggests that apostles have to have seen Jesus during his earthly life and listened to Jesus teaching during his earthly life. That definition leaves out Paul and Barnabas, right? So this is in the book of Acts, and the writer of Acts is supposed to have been a companion of Paul. Think about that one. So Paul denies that his apostleship is secondary to the Jerusalem apostles. He denies this very vehemently in Galatians, and he refers to Peter and James, the brother of the Lord, as the so-called pillars, those who are reputed to be pillars. The so-called, you've heard of the term the pillars of the church. Paul calls them the so-called pillars. How about that? So, what exactly does Paul know, Acts know about Paul? Well, the different images between the image of Paul in Acts and the image of Paul you get by reading Paul's letters suggests to most New Testament scholars that the writer of Acts was not a companion of Paul. Like Acts Volume 1, the Gospel according to Luke, Acts was anonymous. And so we do not know who wrote Acts because it was an anonymous book, as was Luke, as were all the Gospels. Since they are anonymous, both Luke and Acts, there is no way in hell that you can treat Acts as a primary source and rate Acts as a source that should be ranked above the authentic letters of Paul. Okay. Have I said anything that's illogical yet?
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Keep that in mind. I don't intend to say anything illogical. Okay. Now, I've told you the problems. These are problems of research. And let me just tell you that traditional people who read Paul's letters read them in ways other than what I have suggested is the best way. And so finally, I'm telling you how not to read Paul's letters. I've just told you the problems of Paul versus Acts. So to read Paul primarily through the lens of Acts, I urge you not to do it. I urge you not to read Romans through the lens of Galatians. Galatians is very negative on the law. The law is something that Gentiles need to be free from. Whereas in Romans 7, Paul says the law is spiritual, and the law is good and righteous and holy. And the thing about the law is it tells you what the will of God is, and it tells you that you need grace, right? And so in Galatians, the law is not spoken of in such positive terms as it is spoken of in Romans 7. So if you read Romans through the lens of Galatians, you're going to end up with a misinterpretation of Paul. And the traditional interpretation of Paul in Protestant churches has unfortunately done that. If you read Paul through the lens of Galatians, you may read where it says, my former life went in Judaism. And so some people think that Paul was opposed to Judaism as a religion, Jewish people, and even the scriptures of Judaism. And the problem with that is that in every single Pauline letter, except for Philemon, which only has 25 verses, and 1 Thessalonians, Paul's earliest letter, in every letter there are extensive quotations from the Old Testament. If you think the Old Testament is no damn good, Paul, why in God's name, quite literally, are you quoting it? Okay? So if you read Paul as somehow opposed to Judaism, and people have read Galatians that way, and people have read that into Romans, and then that causes you, when you get to Romans 9 through 11, not to, it doesn't even go in one ear. If you think that Paul understood himself to be a miserable sinner, in other words, if you think Paul was writing autobiographically in Romans 7, where he said, "O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death?" And that if you think Paul was writing autobiographically there, he says, "The good that I would do, I do not, and the evil that I don't want to do, I do. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from the body of this death," or this body of death. If you think that Paul was writing autobiographically, it kind of suggests that Paul thought that you couldn't actually keep the Jewish law. But in Philippians 3:6, he says, "By the way, I kept the Jewish law and I kept it very well, thank you very much." Philippians 3:6. So if you think Paul can't keep the Jewish law, and he says nobody can, then you have a lot of problems. You have a lot of explaining to do when you hit Philippians 3:6. Another problem is to read Paul as if Paul had a one-track mind, and this one track was justification by faith, and that there's no other thing that's really important theologically in Paul other than justification by faith, and that and one form of this is to say justification by faith is the center of Paul's thought. And if you believe that, then you're going to have a big problem with 1 Thessalonians, because there's not the merest trace of justification in 1 Thessalonians. And so if justification is the center of Paul's thought, then 1 Thessalonians has got no center. How about that? Another one is if you think that Paul wrote all the letters in the Pauline corpus, and we know he didn't. And I'm going to tell you about the authorship issues next week. And also, the failure to understand that early Christian communities were very, very diverse in their locations, in their ethnicities. That was especially true in Rome. In their socioeconomic status, we know from Peter Lampa's research that many Roman Christians were slaves. There were different leadership patterns, and there were different religious beliefs. Judaism was appropriated in different ways. And so the Greco-Roman religion and Greco-Roman world was appropriated in different ways. And so just because you can say, okay, Paul said this and this is how it was in Corinth, that doesn't mean it was that way in Galatia. That doesn't mean it's that way in Asia Minor, see? Because it says one thing in Colossians, that doesn't mean that 40 miles away in Ephesus it's the same way, see? So you have to understand the diversity of early Christian literature. And the diversity of early Christian literature comes from the diversity of early Christian communities, which comes from the diversity of early Jewish communities. And so I have gone on for too long. We have a little time. Next week we will actually read 1 Thessalonians chapter 1. So read all of 1 Thessalonians next week, and read Thessalonians chapter 1 and its 10 verses very carefully. And then you have a copy of my article, The Rhetoric of 1 Thessalonians, in Ray Collins' volume. And you have a Xerox copy of that. And I'm sorry that it's 32 years old now, but I haven't changed my mind about anything. So there.